More than 300 delegates attended the two-day Agbiz Congress here at Sun City. AI, innovation, sustainability, trade, geopolitics, everything relevant to agriculture in this day and age was discussed. And they elected a new chairman. I spoke to some of the speakers, the CEO and the outgoing chairman. Theo, a very interesting time if you look at our political landscape in South Africa, hosting a Congress. After these 2 days, are you ready for what's lying ahead if you've heard what everybody said?
No, thank you so much. Well, thank goodness we didn't host it a week earlier, otherwise we would have been in real trouble. But no, it is interesting times. I think a lot of the themes that we're discussing at the Congress, these are real challenges that probably go beyond the political sphere. Some of the elements that have been discussed, infrastructure, water, logistics infrastructure, irrespective of political aspirations or policies, these are real bread and butter issues that we need to address. Likewise, there's global shifts taking place, becoming an increasingly more unstable or unpredictable environment, but also that we need to navigate. So it was good to address that, and that obviously speaks to the geopolitical elements taking place in the world. The broader elements that we spoke about today, environmental, social governance issues, sustainability. I know it's a buzzword at the moment, but it's a very real element. I think the whole entire world realizes that we've gone beyond CSI, gone beyond simply greenwashing. We now need serious action around these kind of elements, and it has trade implications as well. And as I mentioned, this is not it's not a challenge that's self-made or politically made. These are real issues taking place. Inequality, climate change. So we need to address it, but it's important, and I think these are some of the great things that came out today is, yes, we need to address it, but it needs to be practical, it needs to be inclusive, it needs to be affordable. So we need to, as the agribusiness sector, almost put our stake in the ground and say, but these are the things we are good at, these are the things we can achieve. We want recognition for those, and if there are other areas that we need to be nudged towards and also nudge the sector, then we need to start working on those. So it is an interesting time after the elections, but to be honest, I think the issues we dealt with go beyond politics.
Yeah, but if I think about the last 2 days, agriculture in South Africa is doing well.
The sentiment is very good. I must say the sentiment is good. I genuinely believe that with some of the big challenges we've had regarding obviously energy security, logistics, I think we have hit the bottom and we're starting to recover. We're starting to bounce back. So there's a real sense of optimism. But at the same time, we're not out of the woods. There are some big challenges around animal diseases, about navigating this geopolitical landscape. So it certainly, the next 10, 15 years won't be easy. But the optimism, and I think the sense of buoyancy that we've seen from the delegates throughout this Congress gives us a lot of hope, because it means we're probably better positioned, or as well positioned as any other sector in the world, to be able to tackle these challenges.
And are you pleased with the 2 days?
Very pleased, very pleased. I think we're very grateful for the delegates that made it, that made the trip out here. It's been a very good outcome for us. I also think that we're building a lot of momentum with some of the issues. We're dealing with these issues obviously in 1 hour, 2 hour sessions, but it's not... It's only the start of it. We're hoping to get the ball rolling, and it will snowball in the next 2 years, building to the next Congress, so we have proper work and we can report back, hopefully in 2 years' time, with some real progress in these areas.
And you also elected a new chairman?
Yes, so Mr. Sean Walsh, the CEO of the Coal Group, was elected to following up Francois Stradum from Senves. So we're very excited, and obviously wish Sean the very best in the position.
And maybe a word to Francois?
A word of gratitude, certainly. I mean, Francois has been guiding us through the tough times of COVID and this increasingly unstable political times, and also just the guidance he's given, and all of the Steerco members that served, many of them who were not able to serve again in the next round. I think just our gratitude to all the guidance and the leadership they gave us.
Thank you.
Okay, so we've established, as part of reconstituting the domestic rail system, we separate infrastructure from operations, which is a requirement that we have with government through the Freight Logistics Roadmap. So we have a sort of set of key targets, and those targets are actually defined by National Treasury, so we have to meet them. So it's a key initiative within Transnet. we established what we call the economic network. Now, the economic network is a combination of all the bulk parts of the network. The dominant flows on our network are iron ore, manganese, ferrochrome, magnetite, and that really dominates what flows on the freight rail network. But there's also the need to have access into all of the key cities. There's also a need for us to have redundancy. In other words, if one line fails, can we move to another line? And then there's also the need to access things like the agricultural community hubs, the domestic manufacturing community, which is largely containers, and that's key links between Gauteng, Durban, Gauteng, Eastern Cape, Gauteng, Cape Town. So we built that into the economic network. Against that network is a set of feeders and what have traditionally been called branch lines. And those branch lines, Transnet has tried and largely failed over a period of time to transact around them. We will continue to try and identify partners for the branch lines. They're in deep rural areas. But the key element of the economic network is to sustain more freight and grow that freight by giving third-party access onto that freight network. We have available slots. Our key challenge is to design a system so that we can bring those slots to market. Where we have slots available, the TRIM, which we call the Transnet Rail Infrastructure Manager, in other words, owns the infrastructure, they will come to market in around October of this year and say, these are the slots that are available. Who wants to operate on this network? Where do you wish to go? And that will largely be based on an origin destination. I want to go from, say, an agricultural hub in Zanin, and I need to access the Port of Durban. And then they would facilitate a slot access, and the network statement, which has already been issued some months back, will define the rules of the game, if you like, for how they can access. Now, some of that infrastructure's condition is not entirely optimal. So there is some risk that we put onto the operator in terms of what we call kind of footsteps. They will have to deal with the same challenges we do on the network in terms of operating trains, which may imply that reliability is not quite what we would like it to be. And obviously allocation of fixed timetable slots will be challenging. We will try and adhere to it, but will be challenging to commit to. So October of this year is our commitment to government. We had initially said September. This is a difficult, long process to define these slots. Part of our challenge as an organization is also to separate TFR into two. That will take place. That's already largely taken place. We have an interim CE for a chief executive for the Transnet infrastructure. So that's already taken place. It's also creates separation in our SAP systems, which is a long process because all the costs are embedded and crossing over between the operator and the infrastructure provider. We hope to have that concluded within a year or so. We do have a time frame, which I don't have in front of me, so I can't commit to exactly the dates. But I mean, a key date to think through is October of this year. That's the first time that we will be able to advertise the slots. We would hope to be able to deal with that process in, say, a quarter, let's say 3 to 6 months, to actually allocate that slot to somebody so that they can actually operate a train. Let's say, if we're talking October, early in 2026. So our funding is determined now on a regulatory model, much the same way that NERSA determines the funding for Eskom, the funding for AXA is determined in exactly the same way, the funding for pipelines is determined in the same way. So there's a lot of precedent in South Africa around regulated assets. Essentially what happens is you put your asset statement forward in terms of what you have as assets that need to be rehabilitated and served, and on the basis of that you determine a price, and we can go into the detail of that, but that's really how it works. Our price is on a ton kilometre basis, and the reason that we've done that is actually to protect manufactured and agricultural freight. And that's an important thing that I don't always know that the different communities pick up, is that if we allocated each line its respective costs, the agricultural community would definitely lose in that process, because if you look at a bulk train from Sishen to Saldanha, it's 375 wagons. It's 100 tons per wagon, whereas for containerized traffic, it's considerably less than that, about 30 tons per wagon load. So if you price on a ton kilometre basis, in other words, on the tonnage that you're moving, you tend to benefit the smaller loads of freight, the mixed freight, the containers, wheat, agricultural commodities, etc. So that's what we've done, and we've taken that lesson from other parts of the world.
South Africa is seen as the food factory for Africa. We heard that quite a few times from you today, Polly. But I think there are a few concerns as far as exports to Africa is concerned. What are the misconceptions?
I think the biggest misconception, first of all, is underestimating the positive demographics in sub-Saharan Africa. The young people, the urbanization, and with those two, the need for proper nutrition and nurture that comes from agricultural products that are well done for the household. Mothers are looking for that for their babies, and families are looking for that. And Africa is underserved from a nutrition and nurture perspective. And South Africa can do it. And the biggest evidence of that is the public health burden that you see, that is born of not so good nutrition, of not so good nurturing that these countries have. So that is one misconception. I think the other misconception is the fact that if I sell my products there, I will not collect my money. And I would say, I think sub-Saharan Africa has leapfrogged even South Africa from a perspective of payment systems. Most countries have become very digitalized. It's very easy to collect your money. So what we need to get out of the way is the challenge of grey listing, which is an externality on the continent, and make sure that we can do wiring of funds properly. I would call the third one is people are scared because perceptibly we haven't traveled intra-Africa as much as we ought to. South African Airways, Ethiopian Airlines, Kenya Airways are now playing a role of getting us to see one another. And we have an opportunity under the Africa Free Continental Trade Area, that vehicle, to start visiting one another a lot more. Not just both for tourism, but culturally. We are very close to one another. It's time to come. The multicultural understanding needs to come through. So the more we visit one another, the more we get to know each other. The last thing is the trade in Africa, especially for agriculture, is done by women. And women are more trustworthy than men by a large factor. If you go to the markets of the continent, you go to Onitsha in Nigeria, you go to Chikubo in Uganda, you go to Mercato in Ethiopia, you come to Shamanini in Mozambique, you go to Rezende, Leopold Takawira in Harare. What you find is loads of women buying and selling. The enterprise of Africa, food enterprise, is driven by women. And there's also a misconception. So it's not done by men. And we who trade there are starting to see that those are both conceptual hurdles and physical hurdles to overcome.
Won't you elaborate on the food factory in South Africa issue that you were not an issue, but that where you want to encourage people to say, look, this is who you are.
Absolutely. Yeah. South Africa hosted the World Cup because South Africa has the infrastructure for sports. South Africa has the best infrastructure of manufacturing, and that either has happened by design or default. If you look at the number of factories and their integration back to the farm, South Africa has an intellectual property it has not leveraged to the level it ought to leverage. Africa is only starting to industrialize now, and South Africa has time. I think the difference between South Africa and the rest of Africa is time, and other African countries are catching up. And from also an energy perspective, a ports perspective, a roads perspective, an intellectual property perspective, labor productivity, you have great farmers. When they are given the land, they really know how to yield from the land. And that is an expertise that's only coming in to the rest of the continent, especially at a large-scale farming that gives bulk commodities to manufacturers like ourselves who then convert it to finished products. So that is South Africa's advantage. And so it's not arrogance to say it's the food factory of Africa. It's to say right now it's the number one. There may be others coming, but South Africa is facing competition. Egypt is a big competitor to South Africa. Turkey is a big competitor to South Africa. I see China as a big, and its overcapacity there is a big competitor to South Africa. So the world is in competition, and South Africa just needs to stake its flag and keep going. Yeah.
ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. So when we talk about ESG, it's just a way that they look at to determine whether or not you're actually evaluate or understanding what the risks are with respect to environmental, social, and governance triggers. So when we talk about environmental, it will mostly revolves around resource use. So how much are you sharing that resource? So is there equitable sharing? And if there's not enough of it, how are we actually managing or reducing our consumption of those resources? The new part of resource consumption is also around climate. So we know that there's climate change, and around resource consumption is often driving this push towards increasing the impact on climate. So by reducing the amount you consume, you can also reduce the amount that you actually impact on the climate. From a social perspective, it's around your people. How do you manage your workforce? How are you managing your engagement with your customers, with communities that you're operating in? And there's certain rules around that. And then from a governance perspective, we're looking at about how do you report? How do you make decisions? Is it informed by the right information? Do you have other people that you consult when you make these decisions? So I'm oversimplifying it, but there's a long list of criteria that the bank uses when they ask you questions around these issues. What they're doing is they're checking whether or not you have these systems in place. Are you actually considering these E, S, and G issues when you're running your business? And that will tell them whether or not you're in a high-risk category or in a low-risk category. So that's the basic gist of it. If you ask about banks, are they ready for this? They've been doing it for a long time. Most banks have an ESG policy, so in other words, a mission or vision statement on how they define ESG. And that's normally informed by their risk appetite. And each bank is different, right? The policy is then also backed up by procedures and ways of doing things. One of the most important, obviously, is the credit risk process. And your credit risk process is what determines who they can lend to and how they can lend to you, right? So when we understand that, and each bank, again, will be different, and what makes the bank different is actually where they get their money from. So banks also try and woo bigger pieces of pockets of money, and those pockets of money have rules attached to how they can give you that money. So what we're seeing now is there's a lot more rules coming out around the E, the S, and the G from the big lenders to the banks, which is then informing how they can lend onto you. And that's the biggest shift at the moment. The central bank, and this is not just South African specifically, all the central banks across Africa are now also providing guidance so that they can get uniformity of approach against all the banks as a minimum of what everybody needs to do. And this is also being brought out with timelines. So most banks are going to have to get this in place by this year, maybe at a push early next year. And you'll start seeing, especially if it's a business that's applying for a loan, you are going to not only have to do a financial or commercial due diligence, they're probably also going to do an ESG due diligence on you as an organization.
Dankie. So dit is 6 jaar, is 3 termyne van 2 jaar gewees. Dit was 'n wonderlike voorreg gewees. Hierdie is dis 'n besigheidskamer, business chamber. So hier is dit ons lede is sakepersone. Ek dink as jy kollektief kyk na almal wat hier bymekaar is, waarskynlik tussen 70 en 80% van alles wat jy eet, drink en aantrek, kom op een of ander manier uit hierdie vertrek uit. So die verlede is dis belangrik vir die konteks, maar eintlik al wat saak maak is jy weet watter kontrak het jy met die toekoms. Want dis die enigste manier wat jy relevant bly. As jy in die oggend persoonlik en in jou besigheid opstaan en jy het 'n kontrak met die toekoms. As jy nie het nie, jy weet bly jy liewerster in die bed want jy's 'n gevaar vir jouself en jou mense. So dis eintlik waaroor dit gaan. In die toekoms het vir my 2 belangrike goeders. Dis hoop en aksie. En al 2 is belangrik, maar die volgorde is nog meer belangrik. Jy het hoop in die eerste plek nodig. Want hoop is dis nie een of ander fuzzy konsep nie. Dis iets as jy wil regtig waar weet wat is hoop. Gaan lees wat het Alexander Pope in sy gedig hier in 1743 het hy dit gesê. Hy het 'n essay geskryf, an essay about man. Hy het oor die bestaan van mens, sy pel was 'n ateïs gewees en die het vir hom gesê, hoor maar alles is mos nou klaar bepaal. Jy weet, hoekom staan jy op, hoekom werk jy, alles is klaar bepaal. En hy het gesê, nee, dit is nie so nie. En hy het dit toe die essay of man, en reg in die middel van daai essay of man, sê, hope springs eternal. So dit, wat 'n wonderlike ding, hope springs eternal. So hoop is daardie ding wat vir jou in gewone Afrikaans sê, al dink ons, al die ekonomiese indicators, die politiek, alles is negatief, ons kan nie môre 'n beter dag as vandag verwag nie, dan is dit ten spyte daarvan dat jy dit verwag en dat jy dit dan met omskakel in aksie en sê, maar die volgende goed moet ek doen. Ek kan nie vir iemand wag om dit wat ek in my hart en in my kop het te laat gebeur nie, ek moet dit doen. En dit is ons eintlik vanmôre, dis wat ons wou doen, om vir hierdie klomp sakepersone te sê, daar's aanvraag vir ons produk. Jy het hier 'n suiwer makro-ekonoom gehoor wat gesê het, alles sê vir my, dit moet slegter gaan. Ek kan nie mooi verstaan nie. Dit is beter. Dis presies dit. Jy weet, in die waardeketings. Dis eintlik 'n opsomming van wat dit is. Daar's geweldige geleentheid. Al lyk alles 100%. Dis eintlik wanneer dit die beste is mos daai ding wat hulle sê, daai minuut voordat die son opkom, as dit heel op sy donkerste is. En dan is alles eintlik out in the wash. Dit klaar, die ergste is verby. Erken dit en vat dit en doen iets daaraan. En dis wat ek hoop, wat Sean en sy span en wat ek glo hulle gaan doen, is om hierdie geleentheid, dit gaan nou oor wat maak ons met die geleentheid. En op 'n manier is dit wat die kiesers mos nou Woensdag gesê het, verlede week Woensdag gesê het, enough is enough.